Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Ariel Garten, and every episode we get inside the head of people who are skilled in the mental arts. Neuroscientists, psychotherapists, those who understand how the brain works, how to optimize it, and how to help us manage the crazy in all of our lives. This week we have not one, but two incredibly awesome guests. We have Dr. Olav Krigolson. He is a neuroscientist who looks at decision-making and learning. And he's at the University of Victoria, and he has an extraordinary insight on some phenomenal processes that go on in our brain. And to have this conversation with him, I have Dr. Graeme Moffat. Dr. Graeme Moffat is also a neuroscientist, and he happens to be the chief scientist at Muse. So Olav is one of our collaborators at Muse. He's been using EEG to understand learning and decision-making in the brains of folks like monks and professional baseball players.
And astronauts.
He's even taken this onto the Mars simulator. And as a very, very special extra little thing, Olav took Muse up into the Himalayas and recorded data from dozens of monks meditating. And we're all going to redo that study. It was so fascinating. We're all going back, Graeme, Olav, and myself, up into the Himalayas to trek to distant monasteries, taking EEG equipment and understanding what goes on in the brains during meditators. So super special episode. We're going to dive into the brain. We're going to dive into meditation. You'll hear all about Everest Base Camp and possibly what it's going to be like on Mars. Welcome, Olav.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Our sincere pleasure. So first question, what's it going to be like on Mars?
That's a great question. I don't know a lot about that, but I know a lot about what it's going to be like on Hawaii right now. So the high seas Mars habitat is on the big island of Hawaii. It is in a red volcanic field, so it kind of looks like Mars, except for possibly the surf beaches off in the background.
Amazing. And so tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there.
So yeah, we are collaborating with Kim Binstead and Gordon Binstead. Kim Binstead's a professor at the University of Hawaii, and she runs the NASA Mars Habitat Project, High Seas. And Gordon Binstead is a professor at UBC Okanagan. And the idea is basically, when people go on long-duration space flight, they're going to have changes in mental state or changes in brain function. And the sort of the research question we're after is, can we track that? And that's where we're going to use the Muse. So we're going to use the Muse to track changes in brain function during simulated Mars missions.
And what are some of the hypotheses that you have around how the brain might change when you're in space?
Well, right now we know that the people that have gone on previous high seas missions have experienced stress because they're in an isolated state for a long period of time. They've exhibited other cognitive symptoms. So the question is, when people have changes in brain function brought about by the environment, can we see that? So you could almost use an analog with like heart rate, which is you could imagine that someone's heart rate is roughly consistent day to day. But if they get some kind of heart condition, their heart rate might change, and you want to detect that and use that as a marker that something bad is happening. So we're planning to do the same thing, but with brain function. So we're going to track their brain function day to day. And we'll assume that when they go in, they're normal and healthy, which will be verified by an array of NASA doctors and scientists. And then we'll look at and see if we can detect changes over time, because we know that they will.
It's amazing.
That's the great thing about brains, is they're always changing. So you're going to measure something. It's just a question of what it is you're going to find.
True.
So that voice that you just heard is the voice of Dr. Graeme Moffat. Just to give you a little context, Graeme was a neuroscientist who looked a lot at auditory perception, and so how we understand the world auditorially. Then he moved into being the managing editor of Frontiers in Neuroscience, and then he's come to work with us at Muse, where over the last 4 years?
4 years.
Where over the last 4 years, he's been understanding how we use novel tools to look at changes in brain state, and specifically how we give people real-time feedback to help improve their meditation and understand what goes on in the brain during meditation.
Yeah, not just that, but also, how far we can push Muse in new directions. So given that we have this very portable, very low-cost EEG system, what are some of the things that can be done with it, and how can it be used in human neuroscience, which is, I think, a burgeoning field now as a result of the availability of new tools. And Olav is probably the leader in deploying Muse in human neuroscience. So he's become one of our very close collaborators and a good friend of ours here at Muse.
Awesome. So, Olav, what are some of the real life situations in which you've looked at how the brain works?
Probably the biggest project we've taken on is a series of projects, which is we got interested in cognitive fatigue. So when people are tired, and their brain is tired specifically, they make mistakes. So we've taken the Muse into the emergency room of the Royal Jubilee Hospital here in Victoria to study fatigue in doctors and nurses, and also in medical students. We've taken the Muse out into the workplace, and we've also taken it up to a mine in northern British Columbia to look at fatigue in miners. And in all those instances, sure enough, we found people that are tired. But the question is, can we then identify that and then potentially allow people to do something about it?
So, first of all, I have to say this is not intended to be a Muse commercial at all. It just so happens Olav's work is totally amazing, and some of it's using Muse, and so that's kind of what's coming up. But we'll talk about all sorts of things today. So tell us, what does the brain look like when it's tired? I mean, we all know what it feels like when we're tired. What does it look like in your brain when tiredness happens?
So there's a couple of different ways you can quantify that. What we do is we have people play a video game, essentially, and there's events in that video game, and we measure their brain's response to those events, and we call that an event-related brain potential. And what's cool about this technology is these responses are reduced when you're tired. So you can imagine when you're rested and you play the game and your brain has a nice, large, healthy response to events in the game. And when you're tired, those responses are reduced. It's really that simple.
And so how might that be used to create an intervention?
So the way we're using it right now is we have people do the test multiple times to build up like a baseline or a profile. So you can imagine that your blood pressure, for instance, changes day to day a little bit. So we build up a profile of sort of brain response scores, if you will. And then when people get fatigued, their scores will drop below that baseline. And conversely, you can imagine they take up a new diet or start exercising, you can track those scores increasing over time.
That's really fascinating. So what are some of the other contexts in which you've been able to see this phenomenon?
Well, the brain response we're talking about is evoked in everyday life. Like, it's basically a response to whenever you look at things. So, if you're wandering down the street and you look at something, if you happen to be measuring EEG at that time, you would see this response. And that's what's kind of cool about it. It's just your natural response to seeing an object or seeing a person or seeing something appear on an iPad. And it's part of the normal visual processing chain that we see in people. And it's just different when you're tired.
So that's really fascinating. So these event-related potentials are essentially a signature that happens in the brain, a little pop that goes off in your brain whenever you see something that's of interest or meaningful to you.
Yeah. And there's a whole array of them. You get, different event-related potentials depending on what's happening. There's auditory event-related potentials when you hear things. There's visually evoked potentials when you see things. And within that, it comes down to what you're processing. So, for instance, if you just see something appear on the screen, you get one visual evoked potential or a series of them. But if you give someone feedback, so you tell them that won and lost in a gambling game, which is something we do a lot of in my laboratory, you get a different evoked response. So in that way, you can probe a whole range of cognitive processes like attention, memory, learning, decision-making, perception.
That's really cool. So within this conversation, as people are listening to it, what might be going on in their brains with regards to evoked responses?
Well, our understanding of these responses is quite limited at this point in time. So, for instance, every time you hear a sound, you're going to see a little squiggle in the brainwave activity, which is your attention system and processing. But we're not so far along as to say you can decode the word they're listening to or decode the picture that someone's looking at, although people are working on those problems right now.
Very cool. So people should just know that as they're listening, they're having little pops going on in their brain every time something's of relevance, something's of salience. So their brain is filled with ERPs at this moment.
Well, that's what's cool about EEG is that every time neurons fire, you get changes in the signal you see with EEG. So you're actually measuring neurons firing in the brain. as opposed to inferring that activity, which is what some other techniques do.
Very cool. So you also have started to apply this in interesting ways to understand how we make decisions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we actually just published a paper this week. We're looking at how people make decisions, and specifically in this case, trying to differentiate between gut hunch decisions or intuitive decisions versus analytical decisions. So we replicated work by actually a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman, and he showed in the 60s that you had a different pupil size when you made an analytical as opposed to a gut hunch decision. And that's sort of been a hallmark for trying to identify whether someone's making one of these intuitive or gut hunch decisions or a slower analytical decision. So what we did is we did this with EEG, and we were able to find that when people make analytical decisions, you get a different EEG signature than if they make gut hunch decisions.
I kind of want to know what the result was from the Kahneman replication on this system 1, system 2 decision making.
So in EEG terms, basically what we found is you get increased frontal theta activity when people make gut hunch decisions, and you get a decrease in parietal alpha. And when people make intuitive decisions, you get the reverse. You get a decreased amount of frontal theta power and an increase in what we call parietal alpha power. And what that basically relates to is frontal theta power is associated with cognitive control. So the more you have to think for an analytical decision, the more cognitive control you need, or the more the prefrontal cortex needs to step up and do its job. And that's represented in the theta power. And the alpha power at the back of the head, that's associated with attention typically. And it's kind of the opposite of what you might think, which is if you see lots of alpha power, that generally means you're not paying attention, or there's a release of visual spatial attention. And if you see a decrease in that EEG signal, it means people are focused. So in terms of our study, when you make a gut hunch decision, you see increased alpha power because people are more relaxed and they're not as focused because the answer is intuitively there. Whereas if they have to concentrate on the problem, you'll see this decrease in alpha power. So basically the brain's responses are changing up and down in different parts of the brain depending on the type of decision they're making. And we can detect that.
That's really cool. And that finding, I think, is related to another experiment that you did with baseball players, looking at the optimal brain state to make the perfect pitch or the perfect hit.
Yeah, that was a project done by a former master's student of mine, Anthony Puda. Essentially, Anthony's an interesting guy. He comes from a professional sports background. He played professional baseball. And when I met Anthony, he asked me a simple question, which was, coaches talk about being in the zone and players talk about being in the zone. And can we detect that with EEG? Like, is that a mental state that you can detect? And my first answer was, I have no idea. So what we did is we put an EEG system, the Muse again, my apologies, on, but it works really well, right? So we put it on baseball players before they went out for batting practice, and then we quantified their subsequent performance during batting practice, and we found out we were able to predict how well they were going to bat based on their brain activity before they batted.
So this is super cool, and we've had previous episodes talking about flow and what does flow look like in the brain, how do you get into flow, and presumably a baseball player who is hitting the perfect hit is somewhere in flow. They're in this, beautiful state where everything's just coming together.
That sounds like what the baseball types would say. All I really know is that what we found is if you look at a different frequency of brain activity, which is beta power, which is brain oscillations between 30 and 30 hertz, we found that increased beta power was associated with decreased performance, and decreased beta power was associated with increased performance. And some people associate with beta power with cortical arousal or cortical activity. So it kind of makes sense that the calmer or the quieter your brain is, the better you perform.
And that's consistent, I think, with a lot of the behavioral sports research too on cognition and behavior in expert level sports, where you look at higher levels of engagement of maybe cortical arousal, or the equivalent of cognitive engagement, predicts better performance in novices, but worse performance in experts. And the more automatically you can process things, and the higher your performance as an expert.
Exactly. So yeah, it's our results lined up with a lot of previous work, and in fact, even some studies with EEG, but there were only a few, and it was quite a limited environment. Whereas we looked at it a pretty dynamic, open environment, which was literally pitchers batters on the field.
So basically what you're saying is that a baseball player who is thinking less, is cogitating less, is probably going to have better performance.
Based on the results of our study, that's what I would say. Of course, as Graeme said, factoring in relative levels of expertise.
So, okay, yeah. So an expert baseball player, and the idea being, once you've learned the pattern, once your body knows what to do, once you've done this 1,000 times, you kind of need to get out of your own way, not think about it, not overthink it, and just execute the pattern that you've learned.
Exactly. And that's actually, this has been known for quite some time. Back in 1967, Fitz and Posner proposed a model for learning with 3 stages. And the first stage is a cognitive stage, or a thinking stage. And the second stage is an associative stage, where you're sort of putting things together. And the last stage is an autonomous stage, where things come automatically. And that aligns up well with what people are seeing, because overthinking is a sign of novice performance. And you could imagine if experts do it, it gets in the way, as you said.
I was under the impression that in that study, you also saw an increase in alpha, because I know in a lot of studies that I've seen, when you're looking at expert performance, there also seems to be this increased alpha correlate.
There were a few hints of that in there, but not a lot in our data. But that is something that other people have seen. So the literature on, to be fair, when we ran this study, we didn't realize how many other people had run similar types of things. So but it turns out they were done in what I'd call a closed environment, so very limited situations with skills you can perform seated at a table or without a lot of movement. So ours was the first one looking at really like a dynamic sports skill. So our results are a bit different. It's probably got to do with the fact that it's a very different type of movement.
So what is it that's changed in neuroscience in the last little while that makes it possible to get things outside of the lab, to do what you say, like bringing it out into the field and doing in the general sense, without specifically naming any pieces of equipment? But.
Yeah, well, all of the technology has gotten smaller and more portable. I think back to my first cell phone, which looked like something out of a bad 80s movie, right? Like it was a big brick with a big antenna, and it weighed multiple pounds. And now my cell phone is a little tiny thing that slips into my pocket. Downstairs in my lab here at UVic, we have, I'm ashamed to say, a $50,000 virtual reality headset that we bought 9 years ago, which performs worse than a $600 HTC Vive. And EEG, or brain waves, have gone the same way. I've got $300,000 research grade systems in my lab, and portable technology is catching up. And I don't know if they'll ever replace it, but what's definitely true is portable neuroscience technology has increased in terms of quality and the data it gives immensely over the past 10 years.
It's amazing. And what does that enable?
Well, it enables you to go out and do these cool projects, right? So if you had have told me when I finished my PhD in 2008 that you'd be able to put an EEG system on a baseball player, batting, or in a Mars habitat, or even taking it up to Everest Base Camp, I would have just started laughing and said, well, no, you can't do that. And now it's relatively easy to do.
So you've had the opportunity to look at what the brain does in real time, look at somebody's real brain activity in situ in some amazing scenarios. You've been able to look at baseball players, imagine what somebody might be like on Mars. And since you guys are close collaborators with us, you brought up an extraordinary opportunity upcoming that we're going to be joining you on. We're all going to be going into the Himalayas, tracking up towards Everest Base Camp, to understand what happens in the brains of the expert meditators who are situated in the monasteries there. So Olav, can you tell us a little bit about what we have coming up?
Yeah, over the past couple of years, I've developed some friendships with some people that do research in the Himalaya region, and it's altitude-based research. And we started planning a trip where we'd be able to go into this region to not only look at that, but also to collect some EEG data from some Nepalese Buddhist monks. And personally, I just find that idea fascinating. So we thought, let's do this.
And so coming on the trip, we have some amazing neuroscientists who specialize in the neuroscience of meditation, like Dr. David Vago. You have a number of research students yourself, and we're going to be trekking through the Himalayas from monastery to monastery, and then developing personal relationships with the individuals that are there and helping to understand what goes on in their brain during meditation.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm interested in decision-making and learning. And mindfulness is supposed to, facilitate that. So if you practice mindfulness or you engage in mindfulness activities or meditation, there's evidence that suggests it should enhance decision-making or enhance brain function at the simplest level. So I think it's a really cool concept. And to be able to investigate that in situ, if you will, in such a population will be fascinating.
With the literal experts. I mean, I always get the question, what does a monk's brain look like? What does somebody who's been meditating for 50,000 hours plus, what would that look like relative to the brain of a novice meditator? And of course, it's a question that we chew on constantly here, that we try to understand at Muse and try to unwind. And we've had the honor of sitting with many expert meditators on mountaintops, in monasteries, in secular situations. But we've never had the opportunity to like this. So it's incredibly exciting. What are you most excited about, Graeme?
I've never done anything remotely like this. My background, the most interesting thing for me, given my background, is I came into meditation via neuroscience. So when I was running Frontiers in Neuroscience, we published a special collection of papers on the neuroscience of meditation and meditators' minds. And so I actually adopted the practice on the basis of reading these papers and saying, wow, this is really beneficial. I should be doing this. Everybody should be doing this. So to come full circle back to that and actually go and get to do some of the science with people like Dave Vago and Olav and have this incredible experience of going up to Tenbushe and hiking all the way to Everest Base Camp is going to be, I think, an unbelievable one, both scientifically and just purely from like an outdoor experiential perspective. I expect it will be culturally and just in every respect will be absolutely incredible and a lot of fun. And to get to do science along the way is a privilege that I think very few people are really get in their whole lives.
Yeah, I mean, when you brought it up, I was just overwhelmed by the thought. I literally almost cried. We come from this rich background, both of, the 2,000 years of deep tradition that created this technology called meditation. The thousands and thousands and hundreds of hours, millions of hours that people have spent applying themselves to this process of focusing their mind for positive intention and the outcomes that they're looking for in the world. And Buddhism is really the seed of all of this tradition that we follow and that we cherish and that we carry and move forward, and that we try to create technology for to help people achieve similar states, but in this secular world. And then we follow the deep tradition of neuroscience. We're neuroscientists here, we're engineers. We follow the tradition of understanding from a deep scientific and technical perspective what goes on in the brain. And to have the extraordinary marriage of those two moments high up on a mountaintop, to be able to sit in a monastery with people who have devoted their lives spiritually and psychologically to this venture, and people who are neuroscientists who have devoted their lives technologically to this venture, and to have the two meet is extraordinary, an extraordinary privilege.
You said it better than I could. Yeah.
I've been trekking in Nepal before. You're in for something special, that's for sure.
That's great.
So maybe this is actually a good time to just pay a little homage to the neuroscientists who come before us, who have identified some of the process of meditation in the brain, people like Richie Davidson. Do you want to talk a little bit about the things that they found in their research?
Olav actually has been featured on a number of, I think, things with, including Quirks and Quarks, which is one of my life goals is to get on Quirks and Quarks at some point. And Olav's been on there like 4 or 5 times. Yeah.
Well, thanks. It was one of my life goals. I guess I'd tick that box. What I find interesting with the meditation work, and I'm happy to have a back and forth with you, Graeme, is the broad range of findings, and there are definitely some consistencies in the literature, but there's also a lot of variability. We look at a paper in our lab by two people, Khan and Polish, and they report a sort of a summary of a range of studies. That paper's getting a bit dated, but even 10 years ago, people were kind of amazed at the range of findings that were out there. But I think we're slowly starting to see some consistencies in terms of the neural activity that you get when people are meditating or in a state of mindfulness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely true. There's one of the unique challenges in the neuroscience of meditation, or for that matter, consciousness studies more broadly construed, is there's no veridical ground truth that you can label your data with what your subject is doing. You're relying on self-report to a degree, and you can use various different kinds of tricks and tasks to try and measure when somebody's mind is wandering versus when they're focused. But there's a really difficult technical challenge to actually doing the cognitive neuroscience of meditation in labeling your data. And there's also this real incredible opportunity. And I think one of the reasons why so many people got interested in it was that it was an opportunity to explore some uniquely human aspects of cognition and of highly specialized cognition and the neuroplastic effects associated with it that we didn't really have a tool to explore before. So we saw that when the Dalai Lama spoke at the Society for Neuroscience, 10 or 12 years ago. This was really sort of a coming out for contemplative scientific research and a recognition of the contributions of the pioneers in the field. And now we're in a more mature phase, absolutely, of the kind of research that's being done on this.
I agree. And there's a really big parallel with, I always think of the parallel with visualization or mental imagery, which is when I was playing sports back in the day, people sort of scoffed at visualization or mental imagery. And now if you don't do mental imagery or visualization, you're sort of behind the curve because the neuroscience behind it is being proven. It's shown to activate your brain. And the same is true with meditation and mindfulness now, which is we're starting to understand how it's, interacting with the brain and what the neural signatures are. And it's kind of cool because you can, as Graeme said, capture this mental state of being, I guess.
And one of the things that we're also seeing is that after a meditation, you seem to have improved cognition.
Are we seeing that?
There are definitely some studies that show hints of that. So if you look through the literature, you see that following mindfulness, you might get an enhanced neural response to something. And that's one of our goals of the trip to Nepal, is we're going to have expert practitioners meditate, and we're going to look at their neural responses to events, the ones we talked about earlier. We're going to look at them before they meditate and after they meditate, and hopefully see that pattern where you get this enhanced response following meditation.
Yeah.
Now, does that directly translate to better brain function? That might be stretching it a little bit, but it's hinting at it.
Yeah. Well, that comes back to the state to trait transition. I think of where does this transition happen between a changed cognitive state and the long-term neuroplasticity that we see in the anatomical studies of meditators. We know that these things happen at some point and gradually over the course of a very long-term practice of contemplative, whether it's yoga or prayer or meditation or whatever it is, and the transition and whether there's a critical period or an induction of a critical period to a long-term transition into this kind of contemplative mind is really one of the big open questions. So exploration of the transient states versus the long-term trait changes is one of the most interesting questions I think left in the field.
And it's certainly something that we as meditators experience. I mean, once you begin to meditate and you have your practice going for a while, you recognize that you're calmer kind of all the time. Mm-hmm. You recognize that your body is not as tense kind of all the time. You recognize that your reactions are improved. You recognize that you're able to focus for longer and longer when you're doing a task. I mean, we understand that there's, as meditators, we understand the range of changes that happen. And obviously those range of changes are reflected in the brain because that is what's allowing you to then, when you're not meditating, have an improved experience, whether it's of increased attention, decreased stress, etc.
Yeah, and I'd say that's generally true of learning in the brain as well. So whatever skill it is you're learning, that's the process by which you go from learning a skill to becoming relatively expert in or highly experienced in it. It becomes much more automatic, and it's almost like a background thing that happens for.
Yep,
that's neuroplasticity in learning.
That's the definition of neuroplasticity. Yes.
Yeah. One thing we could cover that maybe puts some context around what we talked about with the neuroscience and the cognitive science of contemplative practice, broadly construed, is that the changing standards of evidence in the field and the greater certainty that we have now about techniques is partly due to a broader shift within the scientific community toward more open practices and more reproducible practices. So people are sharing their paradigms. They're agreeing on how they're doing the science in advance of doing it, and getting clarity on how they go about the experimentation, so that the findings are less in question when people actually go in and experiment.
And the other thing that's changed too, which is, I think, Muse plays a huge role in, as do other technologies, which is a lot of the research that's been done in neuroscience, prior to, say, the last 5 years, has been very undersampled, in the sense that you have very small sample size studies, because it's been very hard to get the data. So people ask me all the time, what's a normal brain response score and what's a normal amount of theta power to have? And no one really knows. But we do know with heart rate, and we do know with blood pressure. And the reason is because we've tested a whole whack of people. And that's going to change with mobile EEG technology, which is, if you test 100,000 people or 200,000 people who are all meditating, for instance, we'll get a much better understanding of what the mental states look like than looking at studies that tested 6 people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting evolution, I think, of the whole field in neuroscience. We're scaling up sample sizes, but there's only certain modalities where you can do that, and EEG is probably one of the easiest ones.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just, it leads to better science, because, scientists do a lot of statistics to show that their results are true. But the other way to show truth is to test a lot of people. And if the effect is present in lots of people, then you almost don't need the fancy statistics at that point. The statistics that people worry about in science, like the somewhat mythical p-value and things like this, those were invented to allow people with small sample sizes to make claims about populations. Well, the other way to answer that question is just to test a population. And as technology changes, we're going to head more in that direction.
Very cool. So if you could leave the audience with one insight about their brain, what would it be?
That's a tough question. I would say that, the things that our parents told us that are good for you help your brain. So, the research in neuroscience, some of it in my lab, some of it, in other labs, has shown that exercise improves brain function. And that's it's not a myth anymore. It's a truth, because people have seen those effects. Diet impacts brain function. Sleep impacts brain function. I find the sleep research with EEG fascinating, because they're sort of pulling apart that if you don't sleep enough, you're not going to form memories, right? As well as if you sleep less. And all of these things that we were sort of told, this is what you should do because it's good for you, it's getting harder and harder to not do them, because the evidence is sort of become overwhelmingly in favor of doing these things. So I guess it's not really a short thought, but I guess my thought is that, getting lots of sleep, eating healthy, exercising, and doing mindfulness training, these things have all been shown to result in positive changes in brain function.
It's fascinating. Expert after expert that we have on the podcast essentially says the same thing. We had Dr. Dean Ornish on a few weeks ago, and his book, Undo It, is literally all about how basic changes, diet, sleep, loving connection, meditation, improve your life. exercise, throw that one into the mix. They just dramatically improve your life across so many different domains, and the same is true for your brain. How do we as humans make decisions? What goes on in our heads in decision making? And do we have any idea if an intellectual decision is better than a gut decision?
That's a great question. Decision making is it's a really broad question.
So what Olav is dancing around here is that the answer to this question, and psychologists are famous for this, is they can say, I've heard this in multiple talks. You say, for example, is it better to make an intuitive decision or an analytical decision, or any other question really? You could say, I can give you the answer to this right now, and the answer is that it depends.
And it does.
It
does.
does.
Graeme's 100% right, which is, I'll give you an example that we work with, which is, we do a lot of stuff with medical decision making. So we're doing research looking at what's going on in the brain when people make medical decisions. And the medical model is they're especially doctors in training to make analytical decisions. And they almost live in fear of intuitive or gut hunch decisions. So what happens is that experienced doctors might make a gut hunch or an intuitive decision. And the problem with that is what if you're wrong? All right. The analytical process that they're taught, the differential diagnosis is what it's called. It's supposed to help you identify the correct disease and make sure you make the right decision. But that takes time. And sometimes there's a place for intuitive decisions. Sometimes if you need to react quickly, you need to go with your gut hunch decision. So the trick with that stuff is that, as Graeme says, sadly, it depends. I guess you can hope to use the best intuitive decision when that's what's required, and the best analytical decision when that's what's required.
How does a gut hunch work? I mean, we refer to the term gut hunch as if there's some activation in your gut that seems to result in this. But what we're also talking about is brain processes. Like, what is a gut hunch? What's happening in the brain or the gut?
The generally accepted idea is that for a given stimulus, or in other words, a given situation, you have a well-learned response, which is what you use. So you could use the stop sign or stoplight example, which is as you approach a stoplight or a stop sign, your gut hunt, your intuitive decision or the preloaded response is to press the stop pedal because that's what you do. However, there's times where that might be an inappropriate response. You could imagine that it sounds like a bad Hollywood movie, but you're approaching the stoplight and you look in your rearview mirror and there's an out-of-control truck barreling down behind you. You need to process that information. I'm actually not a big personal fan of the dichotomy of like gut hunch versus analytical. As a neuroscientist, I prefer to think of it in terms of cognitive control, which is the extent to which you're using your prefrontal cortex. So if I ask you what 2 + 2 is, it doesn't require a lot of cognitive control, and you've got a very quick, reflexive answer. But if I asked you what the square root of 13,482 was, you would have to exert more cognitive control. But it's a continuum as opposed to a dichotomy. So I guess the long-winded answer to your question is a gut hunch is just your reflexive answer given a situation. And if you don't want to have one present or the situation is challenging, then you need to exert cognitive control to come up with a better answer.
And where in our brain do these gut hunches live? So we understand about this notion of cognitive control overriding a gut hunch or cogitating. What's the mechanics of the gut hunch?
There's still a lot of speculation there. There's definitely a lot of midbrain structures like the striatum that seem to play a role in providing gut hunch decisions. But I'd say there's no target region. Like it's kind of the opposite of the cognitive control, where the prefrontal cortex is heavily implicated in cognitive control. To be fair, it's not the only structure, but the gut hunch is a little bit less localized, I would say. But it's definitely going to be more midbrain paths systems that are providing a specific, here's what you do in this situation.
So
Christoph Koch has this great metaphor in one of his books on consciousness. What is consciousness? Which is a similar analogy to gut hunch versus cognitive control. where he talks about, how you're basically on autopilot all of the time. You're reaching for things without really looking hard at them. And so his metaphor is that you're kind of being driven around, like you're in the back seat of an Uber, and every now and then you lean forward over the front seat and grab the wheel and change direction. But most of the time you're on autopilot. You're sitting in the back being driven around by these automatic decisions.
That's a great analogy. I love that.
And so that brings us back to meditation and mindfulness, where a lot of what you're doing is you're strengthening your prefrontal cortex and taking yourself out of autopilot and adding intentionality to your interactions and existence.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the world of meditation, you often talk about meditation leading to a strengthened intuition. So here we're talking about meditation strengthening your prefrontal cortex and your cognitive control and your attention. But there seems to be this sort of other thing that emerges when you've meditated for a significant period of time. It seems to be that you're more in tune with yourself or the world around you, and it seems to strengthen your intuition in a sense. I don't know if that's anecdotal self-report and not actually matched reality.
The only thing I can think of is, both of you know far more about meditation than I do, but I know that in the literature that the data on this stuff heavily depends on type of meditation.
So maybe one way to look at that is that as you get deeper into your meditation practice, part of what you're doing is you're becoming more sensitive to your own physiology and your own physiological reactions. So you can listen very closely to your body and its kind of intentions and shifts. But you're also downregulating your amygdala. So your amygdala is often creating a lot of noise, like, oh, I should be afraid of that, I should avoid that. And so once you start to kind of remove the noise of your amygdala's jump reaction and begin to listen more sensitively, there's another level of sort of your body, your mind's information that becomes accessible to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis.
I'm just totally spitballing here.
Yeah, no, the amygdala is definitely implicated in decision making, especially under stress, and in a lot of emotional reactions and physiological reactions. One of the things that I think is most interesting that Olav and I learned on one of our trips one of our research trips was we tended to think of continuous physiological monitoring via EEG as something that if you were monitoring vigilance or something and decision making on an ongoing basis, that you'd need to continuously measure and have somebody doing a task on and on. And the people we were collaborating with, I don't know if we're allowed to mention who it is, but they're focused on. Yeah, so it was a branch of NASA that works on commercial pilot safety, training commercial pilots and cognitive and human factors in decision making in pilots. And they thought about it very differently than we did when we actually talked to them about it. They were thinking, if we can teach meta-awareness, if we can teach people to recognize when they're likely to make a wrong decision on the basis of their gut, then they make much better decisions. And for pilots, this is when you, rather than reacting, you go to your checklist and you start to work through a cognitive list of, where you are following a specific set of protocols that are set out to optimize your decision making. As opposed to kind of intuitively reacting in a bad situation and making the kinds of mistakes that they know, based on all of the research, are likely to result from cognitive biases or false perceptions. So if you teach people to recognize when they are likely to make these kinds of decisions, this meta-awareness, then that actually can substantially improve your outcomes. Yeah. And that is an outcome of mindfulness practice.
And meditation, yes.
Yeah.
That's how you put it all together. That's sort of the idea, because I know that you two would probably know better than I do, but my friends in the corporate world are all interested in mindfulness now and meditation, and the idea is that these practices will help them make better decisions.
That's it. Can you tell us a little bit about why you like Muse and why Muse has been an effective tool for you? And feel free to say Muse.
I do like Muse. The best thing about it is it just allows you to do cool research from my side of the fence. I've got undergraduate students where I can give them a Muse and they can go out and do their own research projects. It allows us to ask research questions that people haven't been able to ask. I just think of the last couple of years since I've been working with Muse, and if I make it a checklist, I've collected the EEG data inside an emergency room of a hospital. I've collected EEG data up on top of mountains. I've connected EEG data inside the Mars habitat. We've had students collect EEG data during rock climbing, hiking, you name it. And these are all things that if you had told me in 2008 what I'd be doing with EEG, I just would have said, no way, not going to happen. So I think it's the coolest thing about Me for Muse is it's opened the doors to do all sorts of cool new research.
Amazing. And can you talk a little bit about ERPs in Muse and why that's so meaningful?
Yeah, well, I think, you'd have to ask your own research scientist, but when we first got our hands on Muse, we were curious to see whether you would be able to measure ERPs with a Muse, given the fact that it is a mobile device and to be fair, given the fact that it communicates through Bluetooth. But lo and behold, you can. It's a well-developed device, and the data quality is such that you can pull out an event-related brain potential with Muse. And that, again, opens yet another range of sort of research questions you can ask.
And can you talk a little bit about the papers that have been published using the device?
Yeah, we've got sort of published 3 major papers right now with about 3 submitted. The first one was to be validated Muse, so we put Muse head-to-head with one of our $100,000 research-grade systems. And lo and behold, we got very similar data quality. So we thought that was important to demonstrate that Muse is measuring research-grade EEG. And that led us to our project. So we published Anthony's baseball paper where we showed that we used the Muse to show that you could predict batting performance based on brain activity prior to batting performance. And in the collaboration study with some friends of ours, we used Muse to look at the changes in the brain brought about by high-intensity exercise. And that's a paper we published a couple months back. And now we're in our fatigue era, where we've got 3 fatigue papers that are 2 of them are submitted and one's about to go out the door, where we're showing that we can use Muse to measure ERPs, and then that those things are sensitive to fatigue.
Fantastic. And can you tell us your name, who you are, where you work, what you work on? Just a little introduction that I've packaged.
Yeah, my name is Olav Krigolson. I'm a neuroscientist at the University of Victoria. I run the Theoretical and Applied Neuroscience Lab, where we use various neuroimaging and neuroscience technologies to study learning and decision making. And on the applied side, we use tools such as the Muse EEG headband to ask all sorts of interesting research questions out in the world.
That's awesome. And tell me, how did you get into this work? Why was neuroscience of decision making interesting to you?
Random luck. My undergraduate degree is a Bachelor of Education in Physics and Physical Education. I was a high school teacher, 2 years in Canada, 2 years in the United Kingdom. And I went to Indiana to become a basketball coach. I was in the graduate program at Indiana University. And we had elective slots. And there was a course in neuroscience, and it said a bit about learning and decision-making in the brain. And I thought, if I'm going to teach for the rest of my life and coach athletes, knowing a bit about learning and decision-making in the brain might be useful. And it just changed everything. I was fascinated, changed my major, gave up coaching, and switched to a PhD program in cognitive neuroscience.
Amazing.
Olav has many claims to fame. Among them that he's been in the armed forces. He was a semi-pro or college basketball player, but he guarded Steve Nash in high school. Is that right?
Whoa!
I played with him in spring league. Yeah. I like to think of myself as a Renaissance man. My college teammates were all friends of his from high school.
So tried to guard Steve Nash in summer league.
I tried to guard Steve Nash from time to time.
Now that explains why I wouldn't
have worded it that way back then.
So that explains why I was getting a neck cramp talking to you. Me at 5'2", you at 6 something. Yeah, I didn't put the basketball piece together.
6'4" and shrinking.
And last question. So you have some sort of interesting insights around exercise in the brain, as that's a place where you've been looking at. Can you talk a little bit about high intensity exercise and how it helps? Like high-intensity exercise is all the rage. We only have to exercise for 7 minutes. That's it. Just get all of your muscle groups going and then let them relax and then get them going again. What is it doing in our brain? Why does it work? Why is it cool?
In terms of what it's doing while you're exercising, the general consensus is that cardiovascular or resistance exercise increases brain function, and that's been known for quite a while now. With the high intensity exercise, we actually showed the opposite. But to be fair, we were measuring brain activity right after the bout of high intensity exercise. So what we believe to be true now is when you do high intensity exercise, you get this brief reduction in brain function, which is probably directly tied to you trying to recover from high intensity exercise. I don't know if you've ever tried one of these HIIT programs, but
do them all the time.
I couldn't make the 7 minutes. I made it to about 2.5. But then what we hope to see in the next study is that there'll be a rebound and that brain function will be, on parallel with just regular, your regular blast of 45 minutes on the bike or whatever it is.
So I do high intensity exercise every night. And I've certainly noticed a decline in my cognition immediately after. And then an amazing feeling that
I got that too.
Yeah,
I was actually one of the subjects in the original HIIT studies at McMaster in Marty Gabala's lab.
Oh, okay.
And I've still got the scars on my biceps from the and from on my legs from the muscle biopsies. Immediately after. And this is when it was still. It wasn't like let's do 20 seconds. It was like maximal exertion until you can't. So I had a pretty strong decrement in cognition. Like a couple of times I passed out off the bike. So it was definitely not a lot of ERPs going on then.
So it's your physiology that we have to blame for the fact that we're now all doing HIIT workouts.
Well, they've optimized now. Now it's like 20 seconds of maximal exertion. It's not like 3 or 4 minutes of maximal exertion anymore. But it was, yeah. You can only torture undergraduates like that. I think you can't even torture grad students like that.
Yeah. The one that I'm kind of excited about is my honors student, Kelsey, just showed me some data yesterday, and she was using the Muse, and she was testing people for brief bouts of exercise. So if you go for a 15-minute walk, does it help enhance brain function? And what's cool, lo and behold, 15 minutes is enough to do it. But she got this cool effect where the enhancement was even greater if you did your walk outside as opposed to inside. So we were looking at people that, ride the bike or that kind of thing, but it was, in this case, just walking. But we thought it was kind of cool that just getting out for your noon walk is better for you than walking around inside a building.
Well, I imagine it just spitballing hypothesis here. Possibly the change in temperature allows you to become more alert. The increase in sunlight, the shifting landscape forces you to be more alert, the potential of danger.
Enriched environment?
Yeah. So as a result, you're bringing all of your systems online, which the systems kind of turn off or become inured when you're in an environment that you're used to.
It's definitely, there's a range of explanations. We controlled for heart rate and intensity and the things you'd expect to control for. But, when you go from walking around inside the hallways of a building to walking out, and in this case, it was through a little forested area on campus, definitely environmental differences drove a lot of that. But I still think it's cool that we can scientifically say you're better to go for a walk outside at lunchtime.
Another one of those things that, the things that you've always heard are good for you turn out to be actually good for you.
Oh, yeah, no, we had one last year where Jen Berg, a former honors student, basically showed enhanced brain function following breakfast. So it was kind of a minor project, but she was looking at people that skip breakfast versus people that eat breakfast. And
so
sure
that's
enough,
a really good one. We should do a study on this. It's like people who are in ketosis, who are used to intermittent fasting, do they perform better or worse if you give them breakfast versus people who are not used to this? Like I'm useless if I eat breakfast in the morning.
If you eat breakfast.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us today, for bringing us inside of your mind and inside of all of our minds and how they work.
Thank you for calling it wisdom. I appreciate that. And thanks for having me on the show.
Our complete pleasure.
All right.
By the way, do you have a website or anything that we should reference?
Yep. www.krigolsonlab.com.
KRIGOLSON.
LAB.com.
And Olav is that neurosci guy on Twitter.
All right. So Olav's that neurosci guy
I am that
on
neurosci
Twitter.
guy.
Olav is that neurosci guy on Twitter.
With a podcast coming perpetually, but I'm hoping this year.
Okay, and you can check him out at olavkrigolson.com. That's OLAVKRIGLSON.com. And for anybody interested in this Muse thing that we've been talking about, again, apologies, this wasn't intended to be a Muse commercial. But Muse has been used in some pretty amazing studies with Olav in his lab. And Muse is also used by hundreds of thousands of people to help them learn to meditate. You can get real-time feedback on your brain and know what happens in meditation, know when you're in focused attention, and know when your mind has wandered in order to help you begin or enhance your meditation practice with real data from your brain. I'm Ariel Garten, and this was Untangle. Have an awesome day.